Hello and welcome to the EAVI Conversations Podcast, where we explore a wide range of topics with inspiring and thoughtful guests. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Today, we are joined by Paolo Cesarini, Program Director of the European Digital Media Observatory and the European Media and Information Fund at the European University Institute. With decades of experience in EU policymaking, Paolo has played a central role in shaping media and digital policies, from antitrust and state aid to tackling online disinformation and steering the technical transition of Europe's media sector. His work bridges regulation, innovation, and the societal impact of digital platforms, making him one of the most influential voices in European media policy today. In this episode, we briefly discuss how fostering trust and confidence in AI and digital technologies can strengthen people's belief in their ability to drive change. From there, we turn to the European Union's regulatory competencies in digital media and how big tech is reacting to these policy directions. We first started off our conversation by asking Paolo for advice on how people can overcome their fears around generative AI.
Well, the first advice is to remain confident, because the risk is by delegating your cognitive abilities to systems outside of yourself, you end up by not to believe in yourself anymore in the long run, in your capacities, in your own ability to create your own world vision. That is one thing. So those are tools which are useful as so far as they remain tools, not extensions of your own brains and feelings and world vision. The second thing is, and that is more directed to educators, there is a risk today to demonize these tools and to raise the level of alert around all the fakes that can be created through generative AI, for instance, is a good thing because awareness is needed. But there is also the risk that at the end of the day, nobody will believe to anything anymore. So there is the risk that even genuine information, genuine products of creativity are being perceived as a product of artificial intelligence and not human. And that is an even worse prospect. If people start to be skeptical about human creativity and human ability to create the world, to make the world, then we are in a full swing towards a dystopian, a real dystopian future. So there are two aspects to technology. One is loss of confidence at the individual level. And the second one, it is about loss of confidence in human ability to make the world.
Then we also asked about the European competency in digital media. Are the current European policies doing enough? Let's listen.
I think we have built up in Europe a very solid, a very complete, not only regulatory, but I would say policy framework, which combines regulatory aspect, but also non-regulatory instruments, the support to media literacy, the support to the fact-checking, the support for research, right? It is something that is nothing to do with regulation, but it is essential in order for regulation to be effective. Now, I think the real challenge is about implementation. And implementation doesn't necessarily mean to be robust, to make a show out of the rules, to make a force, a show of force, of strength, of power. It's not a power game. There is a real imbalance between regulating platforms and creating space for freedom of expression. So you have the DSA, you have also the Media Freedom Act. The future will be not to lose sight that this instrument need to work together, hand in hand. The objective is not to suppress speech. It is really to create an environment that enable freedom of expression.
We also asked Paolo about his perspective on how big tech companies react to these policies.
No, they hate it. I think it's clearly they hate it. And they talk about the Brussels effect. I would like to return to that there is also a Washington, D.C. effect these days. And this effect can be seen already in the actions that certain governments are taking, like in Serbia, in order to suppress uncomfortable and disagreeable journalists or fact-checkers. And they're emboldened by this new wave of free speech absolutism that in reality is nothing else but a suppression of free speech undercover. But they are emboldened in order to take action that were probably without this White House effect would not have been daring taken.
We continued our conversation by asking about the recently adopted Code of Conduct of Disinformation and how big tech like Meta responded to it.
They withdraw. No, they withdraw from what? They withdraw from a code, from the commitments that they make to the code, but they cannot withdraw from a set of measures that are identified as good practices and therefore as a benchmark for the enforcers, in this case the European Commission, to establish what would be sufficient and relevant risk mitigation measures under DSA. In other terms, even X that has completely abandoned the code of practice, well, X will be judged, will be accountable under the blueprint, under the benchmark that has been set out in the code of conduct. So even if you do not subscribe, you remain accountable. For me, it's a totally self-defeating strategy. Why? On the side of the platforms. Why? Because in reality, if you subscribe to the code, if you adhere to the code, if you implement the code, you create for yourself a kind of safe harbor. So you are compliant by definition. If you do not subscribe to the code, you need to prove your case.
Next, we touch upon what Paolo thinks about community fact-checking on digital platforms with regards to the new code of conduct.
So there are different things. The code of practice is a complex instrument. There are many aspects in it. So there are the aspects that are direct mitigation measures regarding the design of the services, like algorithms. So what are the solutions that you could envisage in order to make these algorithms more reliable, more accountable to the users? And that is one thing. Then you have other commitments that look at how to preserve the integrity of the services against external attacks, like, foreign actors that manipulate the infrastructure in order to amplify the reach of their own narratives. That is another aspect. Then you have other measures which are not content specific, that are completely content neutral, and which concerns the collaboration with fact-checking organizations, support, also financial support for fact-checking organizations, that concerns cooperation with media literacy organizations, including taking up best practices that come from the specialists on the grounds. And you have also another, very importantly, commitments that concerns the access to the platform's data in order to advance research in this field, right? All this, it is really deplorable that the platforms have been withdrawing from this type of measures under the pretext that the code would be an instrument for censorship. Why it is deplorable? Because it's false. Because measures which are not content specific cannot in any way restrict the circulation, the distribution, the creation of the content in any way. So this is simply pure hypocrisy.
Next, we asked how this process affects the self-regulation practices of digital platforms.
Well, we are no longer in a game of self-regulation. We are in a game of co-regulation. Now that the code of practice has become code of conduct, now that the code of conduct has become a kind of benchmark in order for the DSA to be implemented in cases where the Commission will be able to prove that there is a systemic risk and there is harm, in those cases, well, the platforms have two options. Either they go back and humbly subscribe to the code of practice and they create for themselves a safe harbor, or they decide to play the hardball. In that case, they will have to prove that the mitigation measure that they have or not have taken will shelter them against the sanctions that the DSA provides for.
We finished off our conversation by asking Paolo to what degree EU competencies can be extended.
That's an interesting question, of course, but that concerns more in my view, more the European Media Freedom Act than the DSA. The DSA is an extension of the e-commerce directive, which has been enforced for 20 years, which has never been contested in terms of compliance with the scope of the competencies given to the European Union, which is clearly linked to the well-functioning of digital markets. And therefore, Article 114 remains a very solid legal basis. On the front of the European Media Freedom Act, of course, there is a little bit more of a gymnastic in order to, capture areas where member states have always preserved their own competence in terms of regulating media and pluralism. But at the end of the day, if you think about the fact that we live more and more in interconnected media systems, I'm not saying that we have a European market for media, because that would be too much. We have different languages, we have different cultures, and therefore the market is still technically segmented along these lines. But the operators, the media service providers, are able to operate cross-border, taking into account the cultural constraints, the features of the market in which they want to operate. And therefore, they need to have a single set of standards in order for their operation to expand cross-border. So the argument 114, Article 114, so the single market argument, it is also valid for subject matters like pluralism and freedom. Of course, there is a stretch in the reason. There is a stretch because preserving the safety of journalists is a matter of security, is a matter that therefore comes within the competence of the member states. But member states have adopted, has accepted. So we are in a situation where there is agreement about the legal basis. I think that doubts are beyond. We are beyond those doubts.
Thank you for listening to the EAVI Conversations Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, feel free to explore some other episodes or check out our social media platforms. Stay tuned. There's more to come.